Hello and welcome to this video on how DNA is used in criminal proceedings. Forensic DNA is often depicted as the be-all and end-all of a court case. While it is true that in some cases it can be the linchpin, often DNA is just part of a larger portfolio of evidence. Not that you would know this from depictions like this in shows such as Law & Order.
There are times when I love this job. 31 blood samples, all HIV negative.
Thank you for small favors. I should tell the parents.
No need. I already received 17 bottles of champagne and 8 bottles of scotch.
The bearer of good news.
Well, wasn't all good. It's the strangest thing. 25 of these babies are CF carriers.
What's CF?
Cystic fibrosis. It's a recessive trait like blue eyes. They'll never show any symptoms, but if they happen to make babies with another carrier,
The disease will show up.
2 carriers connect. It's 1 in 4 chance the kid will be affected. CF carriers are a very small part of the population, but still it's a risk.
If they're a small part of the population, isn't it odd that so many of these babies are carriers?
Well, it's either cause for an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, or
They're all related.
DNA is a very powerful tool, and that is why it can be compelling for a jury or judge, especially if there's no opposing evidence presented. The reason it is powerful is that every 3 pieces of DNA or residues code for an amino acid. These amino acid triplets are built up to form a protein. In other cases, the triplet codes for start, stop, promoter, and regulatory sequences. Each gene is made up of a long series of these residues. More than just nucleotides make up the parts of a gene that code for products. There are regions called introns and exons. Introns make the express products, but exons are areas that do not have an expression role. They can have other functions such as regulating by increasing or decreasing gene expression and more. That's a very broad nature of what a gene is, how it is structured, and what it does. The catch in all this is that not all genes are the same, even if they make the same end result. There are various mutations that have occurred either very recently or a long time back to an ancient ancestor. These are often mutations in a single nucleotide. These are also called single nucleotide polymorphisms. The acronym is often pronounced as SNP. SNPs differ from substitution, in which one nucleotide is replaced with another. Substitution is often deleterious and leads to disease. SNPs are different in that they are found in roughly 1% of the population and generally have no deleterious health effects or affect development. Some of these differences can, however, be very important in the effect they have on the function of whatever the gene's for. You will find that throughout every individual there are many different SNPs. These aren't a problem, but there's about 1 in every 1,000 that have changed. This means that your body will have millions and millions of these. In fact, the average person has somewhere between 4 and 5 million in their genome alone. This is why they are so very important. They are regularly found in the population, with at least 1% of the population having any given particular nucleotide changed, and that every individual has many of them. These SNPs and similar mutations are a big part of criminal proceedings. You start with your crime scene or similar, and a sample is taken. Generally, something like a swab is used to collect fluids, although it can sometimes be a solid, for example, skin tissue. Usually the police would collect this, although depending on the circumstances such as sexual assault, it could be done in a hospital. Either way, the proper procedures are followed to collect forensic samples. These are then sent to a laboratory. Laboratory processes this by taking the DNA and separating it out from wherever it's been sourced from. This could, for example, be semen, tissue, spit, chewing gum, anything like that, as long as it has DNA in it. The DNA is then used to create a profile of things like the SNPs, that is, which nucleotides have been substituted in which particularly chosen set of genes. Generally, there is an array that are selected, and this array is what's used as the evidence. The array creates a profile of what the DNA is and what the sequence of those certain genes is. By selecting these and isolating those genes in particular, you can create a particular layout, and then you can try and match these to a person's genome that you suspect as being the one to have committed the crime. The way this works is a little more complicated than just having a particular set of genes. Having just one mutation isn't quite enough. What you want is to look at a series of changes as well, and this is where the SNPs become very important. We've mentioned how you need 3 particular parts of the genome to create a protein. That is, you need 3 nucleotides in sequence, and these then make a given particular function, often coding for a single amino acid. You then take these and you can then look at how often they repeat, how they repeat, and what that repeating function is. By doing these, if you get, for example, something like a short sequence, you're likely to find that you don't have problems of reliability. For example, rather than just relying on a triplet, you might rely on 4 repeating patterns. These are short tandem repeats, and are relied on more frequently than just the triplets. Depending on the other evidence available, this can by itself be compelling evidence of guilt. For example, you may find that there is a particularly unusual and rare change in the nucleotide sequence for your individual. As a result, they are the only person likely to have this from the available group of people that you are considering as being suspect. It's also particularly useful if you're trying to create a profile of people who will be included in a database, and that this can be cross-checked for their past history, even if their names or faces change. This, as the laboratory part, is not enough by itself. There was always going to be some overlap in the genetics of people. That's why one individual might be suspected, but they could, depending on the community they're from, be very closely related, and so you might find that that overlap is much more than you would otherwise expect. You need to find a way to figure out if the person you are pointing the finger at is the one responsible, and the only way to do this is statistics, and it is why statistics are a very important part of this. When it comes to the use of DNA in forensics, it's not really a match so much as it is a statistically likely match or statistically validated match. These aren't the same thing as saying this is the person. This is the same way of saying this person has such a probability of being a match. And the importances of that are very, very, very clear once you look at what's happening. Taking the example of a group of people who are related, they're all going to have the same genes, and chances are they will all have many of the same mutations. If you find that some of them have particular differences, you could say, we found 1 in 10 of the locuses we've looked at are different, and that this person is the one person we found who has that. So there is a 1 in 10 chance that we could be wrong. That'd be like saying 10%. Once you start expanding this out to much more common and prevalent genes or locuses, you can then say there's 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1 million, and 1 in 1 billion, and so on. It gets to a point where you can narrow it down by testing specific locations, alleles, and locuses, and figure out whether or not, in many cases the 9 that you have used, although in some jurisdictions more or less, there is a chance that the individual isn't the one who's the source of that DNA. The idea here is not to say that they are an explicit match. Although technology does allow for high throughput sequencing of genomes, and it can be done, it's not practical to do so for criminal proceedings. It is still somewhat expensive, time-consuming, and requires expertise. If you can, with an appropriate degree of statistical certainty, say, this person based on this many tests in this limited location, you can get a very good idea. This is where probability is the cornerstone of forensics and DNA, and where they come to something of a disagreement. DNA is unique to every individual. The problem is how much of that DNA is the same and can therefore be ignored, and how much is different. And it's the percentage difference that becomes very important. If so much of the population has the same particular genes, you can begin to narrow it down to that percentage. So, for example, of 100 people, 30 of them have a particular gene, and you can test for that particular gene or locus. You can now say that there's a 30 in 100. This is a process that if, for example, you're using 9 locuses, be repeated 8 more times. That means you can narrow it down from an 30% to, say, 10%, 5%, 2.5%, 1.25, and so on. Gradually getting to a point where, from the whole population, you need to have so many people that you could be picking from in a given area, time, and in certain characteristics that would then be able to be substituted for your suspect. For example, finding one person in the whole of New York City, China, India, or other places with a very large and concentrated population, it would be very hard to pick all of the same 9 particular features that are unique to individuals and be able to choose one person and not have everybody else pick the same person. This is where the last step in the process comes into play, and that is the product rule. It involves taking the frequencies of each of the known 9 locuses we've mentioned, and this is the same basic process. How many of the locuses you've tested and the results obtained would match each of the other remaining locuses, and at the end of that process, what is the improbability that it could be someone else? That's why it is a statistically likely, not a absolute match. There are several problems that arise from DNA tests. The most important is that you don't have enough of a sample. You may not have enough raw material to begin with, and this may lead to not having enough DNA, which then leads to a weak result or reading. That means your results can be brought into question. After all, if your results show a weak match, it might be possible that the reading's inaccurate, or that the gene was somehow being misread. All of these things raise arguments as to the validity of what's happening. It's also possible for there to be a partial match to another person, and it's one of the big reasons why statistics are used the way they are. This is particularly common in communities that are more inbred. That is, the genes that you would normally look at tend to be more prevalent in that population. So the more common loci used don't tend to be as reliable, and so you need to become more creative in what you look at and find ways to analyze the DNA in a way that will specifically make the individual who has been suspected not necessarily match, but be easier to match and isolate from the rest of the population. That is, your original, say, crime scene sample must be processed in such a way that you have enough possible ways of narrowing down matches that you can exclude people over time using more unique and, as mentioned, unusual locations. This is not done in a way that is predisposed to a suspect. Rather, you choose the options that are available in the genome before you look at the suspect. This means you are creating a bias beforehand. This isn't to say that all laboratories are perfect at all times and in all ways. Errors can, do, and will happen. This is one of the reasons why innocent people can be either falsely matched or, in some cases, falsely convicted. It's one of the reasons that proper record keeping is important. It's also rare, but not unusual to find that some DNA test results can be marked as possible contamination. And this is very important. That indicates that the test results should be questioned, and ideally the defense should challenge them.
Is it once?
4, Your Honor.
Are you challenging? Is it once?
4, Your Honor.
Are you challenging the constitutionality of the
Your Honor.
Are you challenging the constitutionality of the arrest? You're questioning the DNA procedure, and you're moving to have the charges dismissed. That's 3.
You flipped right past it.
Okay. Well, here it is. Motion to suppress the witness ID. This is quite the ambitious defense. Have the people received copies of this little blizzard of paperwork?
We just received them, Your Honor.
And the people...
One reason why multiple loci are used, and especially from different alleles, is that you can sometimes find, especially in sexual assault, that there is more than one contributor. This means it can be very hard to separate out the DNA from different individuals. This is where even statistics and DNA in combination struggle. The reality is that it's very hard to figure out who contributed what to it. And while there are statistical models that can begin to work out the probabilities of who contributed what, they are still a very crude approach, and it's very difficult to figure out what's happening. This is all the more true when the loci that are being looked at are closer to each other. That is, if they come from either the same gene or a very closely related gene, it can be difficult to know whether or not a particular given sample is from person A, B, or C. This is why many assessments of DNA are conducted on the premise that there are only two people involved. That is, the person who put the original sample in, obviously from a crime scene or similar, and the person the test sample has been taken from. Statistics can indicate that it is unlikely that another person is involved or would have the same DNA as the crime scene sample, and ideally that is where reality would match with theory. Unfortunately, reality and theory rarely go so neatly hand in hand, and it's the statistical certainty that is nearly always challenged in court. The idea that one individual might be 1 in a billion means that there is only 7 other people in the entirety of the world who are likely to have the same particular changes. Unfortunately, those people are also likely to be related to the individual in question, either a sibling, a parent, cousin, or child. The courts have come to accept that the proper statistical evidence is needed and appropriate expertise provided to justify why a forensic genetic analysis will claim that X percentage of probability exists. The certainty of this needs to be backed up, and you need to be able to properly explain what model is being used and how it undermines what has been said. Without this, the foundation upon which the entire premise of DNA in forensics and criminal proceedings becomes very weak, and it's unlikely that a jury will believe people simply because they say this is what it is. As is often the case, if you can't explain what's happening, you obviously don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, can you really be doing the thing that you're claiming to be doing properly? There is, as said at the very beginning, a certain amount of deference given to DNA in court proceedings, whether that is criminal, paternity, or anything else. But that is largely built on the premise that it is a much more powerful tool than it truly is. A lot of it is built on statistics, assumptions, and the ability to be able to do what you're trying to do accurately, effectively, and base it on a model that's going to work for what's happening. On the other hand, there are many situations in which it is possible that not only is this something that isn't flawed, but is in fact incredibly accurate and powerful. It's going to vary a lot on the ability of the person conducting it, the ability of the prosecution to present it and effectively deliver evidence, and the defense to question and, to a degree, argue against what is being presented, and then the jury to decide who they believe, based on what we've described so far. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.